Analysis and key quotations from Mrs Birling from Inspector Calls. Priestley presents Mrs Birling as a very traditional woman who upholds the patriarchy and class divisions. She is unsympathetic and prejudiced towards those from the working class, and she's very much uncompromising in her views. In the opening stage directions, Priestley refers to Mrs Birling as a cold woman and her husband's social superior. We see the superiority when Mr Birling tries to thank the cook, and she says reproachfully, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things." The stage direction reproachfully shows us that she is disapproving of her husband thanking the cook. It was actually meant to be the job of the guest to thank the cook and not the host. This shows us how rigid she is in her views and how she strictly adheres to the social etiquette expected of those from the upper class. Mrs Birling is preoccupied with this facade of respectability, and she expects her family to act accordingly. Mrs Birling shows her elitist attitude and her prejudice towards those of the working class. Rather than referring to either by name, she says she's a girl of that class, or as if a girl of that sort would refuse money. By referring to her as a girl is not only condescending, but it belittles Eva Smith and dehumanises her. It shows us the lack of respect that she has for Eva Smith and the lack of acknowledgement she has in the part she played in this particular individual's death. It's ironic that Mrs Birling holds such negative opinions of the working class when her own son assaulted Eva Smith and stole money from the company. Mrs Birling abdicates any responsibility for her involvement in Eva Smith's death, even though she used her influence to have her case refused, all because she called herself Mrs Birling. By calling herself Mrs Birling, she says that is naturally one of the things that prejudiced her against her case, and said that the girl only had herself to blame, and told the inspector to go and find the young man who was the father of the child. Mrs Birling takes personal offence to Eva Smith using her name and sees it as gross impertinence. She believes that Eva Smith has overstepped her boundaries and doesn't know her place, and now sees her as the undeserving poor that doesn't deserve her help. In Act 3, Mrs Birling still takes no responsibility of her actions and says, really, from the way you children talk, you might want to help him instead of us. Now just be quiet so your father can decide what we ought to do, and then looks expectantly at Birling. By referring to Sheila and Erica's children, infantilises them and shows that she doesn't respect their opinion. Mrs Birling upholds the patriarchy. Rather than allowing her children voices, she silences them and suggests to us that she thinks that women and children should be submissive to the male authority within the house. Mrs Birling believes that her children are obligated to take her side even when she is wrong. This echoes Mr Birling earlier in the play when he says that a man needs to look after himself and his own. By looking expectantly at Birling to make the decision shows that she's reinforcing gender roles and believes that men should make the primary decisions. Mrs Birling's character not only shows us the upper class's prejudice towards the working class, but shows us the lengths they'll go to in order to preserve their power and influence in society.